Let's get into it, everybody. And we'll start with a quick intro. My name is Joe Formica. I am going to be your instructor here tonight. I've been a senior product designer, researcher for about the past 10 plus years, and now here at Listna tonight teaching you how to maximize and really get the most out of your research efforts. All right, so let's start out, as I said in the intro, by kind of setting the foundation here and talking about the value of UX research. Even in just the question I asked in the intro, a bunch of your responses referred to or alluded to understanding the value of research, communicating the value of research. So while I think probably everyone here has some idea what that is, we're going to break it down a little bit more specifically. And really the goal is to break away from kind of this vague, nebulous idea of value and getting to something a little bit more concrete. So in thinking about the value of research, or I guess anything, we can talk about the costs and the benefits. In terms of UX research, the biggest cost to doing research is time, right? And this can be kind of translated to time and putting a monetary number on it for your time or your salary or your freelance rate as a designer. But it can also be something like the opportunity cost, the time that you are spending interviewing people, sifting through post-it notes, and synthesizing research. Those all represent some kind of cost. Now, there are secondary costs to tools, participant incentives, recruitment. There are other more, I guess, fixed or straightforward monetary costs involved in research. But the biggest cost being your time as a designer and the opportunity cost, the time that you're spending on research instead of doing something else, building or designing new features, let's say. So when it comes to the cost, a lot of times the perception with clients that I've worked with, stakeholders, teammates even, is that time spent on research is time not spent improving the product. It's not so much the fact that research is the problem, it's the fact that research takes time often, and that can take time away from other things that a stakeholder might feel has a more direct impact on the product. Now, the benefits of research, if you're here and listening to this, this is probably one you have a pretty clear understanding of, but ultimately it's getting insights that are going to lead to improvements, right? A better product, a better user experience, a positive impact on business goals. Ultimately, that's if you're working on a product with users and consumers, this is something that is going to matter, right? How can this research ultimately lead to a better product and experience? So the common challenge is, or the common perception around it, is making that connection between interviews or research and those goals that your stakeholders might be more interested in or more directly interested in, like a conversion rate or growing your user base. Okay, so sorry if this is a little small, but I'd say in an ideal world, or maybe with some of your clients or stakeholders or people you've worked with, this might be what research would look like in an ideal world, or maybe what they assume or think research looks like. A straight line, simple, direct path from starting your research journey to getting insights that will directly improve product, business goals, user experience. As we all know, research doesn't really look like this. It's not like you go out, do a couple interviews, and then immediately have that game-changing feature that's going to totally help grow your product and reach all of the goals and turn your satisfaction into, give you the highest possible user satisfaction. It happens over time, and it is certainly not as direct as this diagram would show. This is probably more what you were picturing with what user research actually looks like. It's rarely a straight line. It's usually a winding path full of a lot of twists and turns. And along the way in the path of a research initiative, there are a lot of maybe roadblocks that come up, or turnarounds or speed bumps, however you want to think of it, these checkpoints that can lead to more time and rework involved in the research process. So for example, you might realize mid-project that you need to rework your interview questions or switch to a different method. Now, this is something that is normal, that can happen and can be expected in some ways. But if you do a bunch of interviews and then realize, I got to go back and change these questions around a little bit, that is going to make a windier path and ultimately add to the time that you're spending on your research. We could have some of these roadblocks or speed bumps where things just take longer than expected. Maybe it takes longer than expected to recruit the right participants. You thought it was going to take a week. It ends up taking 2 weeks to recruit and schedule interviews. This can lead to extended time and, as we saw, cost of research. And then sometimes there are just mistakes that happen, human error. You forget to press record on your user interview. Has anyone done this? I've definitely done this one before. And while you don't want it to happen and it shouldn't happen every time, just another example of something that can come up in the research process that can derail or extend the time of it. So kind of the kicker when it comes to UX research is that even after navigating all these roadblocks and some of the things we just looked at, there's still this level of uncertainty about the outcomes that are going to come from research. Is it going to lead to better products or decisions? Oftentimes with research, just kind of by the nature of it, we don't really know for sure until much later. So we have this big, winding, time-consuming process with a lot of twists and turns in the road. And by the end of it, it's certainly not guaranteed that we are going to have an outcome that answers our question or helps us make the right product decision. So to that, maybe it's a little bit easier to empathize. No wonder it's hard to get buy-in, right? If you're outside of the research process and you're putting yourself in the shoes of a stakeholder, or I'm thinking of several clients that I've worked with who I had to really kind of fight that uphill battle to get time and resources to do research. At the time, it's frustrating, right? But when you zoom out a little bit and look at it from this perspective of a long, time-consuming, costly, kind of vague, winding road that doesn't necessarily end in a actionable, impactful answer, you can maybe see a little bit more why it's hard to get buy-in. So what we're talking about here tonight is two things. Number one, let's go back here. How can we make our research time more efficient with less wasted time? Efficiency, reducing the wasted time, and avoiding those roadblocks where possible. Some of them are naturally going to come up in the research process, but there are a lot of things that make up this winding road in a typical research initiative that we can improve on and make more efficient. Second thing that we're talking about in terms of maximizing UX research on a budget is not just making it more efficient and cutting corners or creating the fastest possible research path, but also making it more effective in helping us achieve these high impact goals. We can't make research a totally straight line from asking a few questions to making the best possible product decision for us, but we can make it more efficient by eliminating some of those roadblocks, time wasters, cost wasters, and taking some steps initially in planning our research to make sure that it's going to be more impactful and more effective. And I think just looking at this, I don't know if these diagrams are making sense to anyone watching, but the idea being that this is going to be a hard sell to get resources for. And this one is going to be a little bit easier and a little bit easier to deliver on some of the value that research can produce. So how can we make our research more efficient and effective? And here's where we're going to dive into the 3 ways that you can waste precious research time. And of course, more importantly, 3 ways to avoid wasting that time and to be able to do it more efficiently and effectively. So we're going to talk about 3 common ones. I'm going to give some examples of each. I'm going to give some tips, and we're going to have a few activities in some of the later ones. First one we're going to cover in just a sec is how not to waste your time with unfocused research goals and methods. Second one we'll look at is not wasting time talking to the wrong people. And 3, don't waste precious time with participants, specifically that one-on-one FaceTime interviews where you're talking and learning and absorbing all that good knowledge directly from a participant. These are some of the areas in my experience where I've made plenty of mistakes that wasted research time or made it less impactful that I had hoped for. And 3 areas where I've seen designers that I've worked with, mentored, taught also fall into some of the same traps. So while there are other ways to accomplish some of the things that I'm talking about in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, these are 3 big areas that if you can make some improvements on, it will really give you a lot more runway, even if you're resource strapped for the research that you're trying to do. All right, cool. Let's start with our first one. Don't waste your time with unfocused research goals. And I'm going to also kind of add in research methods to match. Let's dive into this one. Okay, so without clear research goals and methods to match them, you're going to spend a lot of time and waste a lot of time in many cases gathering and analyzing feedback that doesn't really get you closer to solving the specific problem or answering the specific question or achieving the goals that you're looking to when you start out on a new research initiative. So we're going to start this one with a quick example here with an example app that I've used quite a bit before for similar lessons. Okay, I want you to imagine that you're a researcher for Care Connect. Care Connect is an app where parents can find and hire babysitters or child caregivers. The problem is that many users are viewing profiles of caregivers, but not completing a booking, not actually scheduling them either for an interview or to come and take care of their child and offer their services. So our goal is to obviously improve that, right? Maybe the goal of the business and the team at Care Connect and across the board is to improve that conversion rate. And as researchers, our goal is probably going to be more about understanding why parents aren't completing bookings and maybe identifying some ways to increase the conversion rate from people who are just browsing profiles and seeing potential babysitters or caregivers, and being able to figure out why and to improve the motivation or the trust or whatever factors for them to turn into paying customers and actually hiring someone. Okay, so if the outcome that we want is to identify ways to increase the conversion rate from browsing profiles to hiring babysitters, we're going to look at 2 different research goals and methods, and we're going to compare these to see how a more focused research goal and method plays out and how one that is a little bit more vague, let's say, can end up in you doing a lot of circles and rework in your research process. Okay, so we want to ultimately solve this problem of customers who are viewing profiles of babysitters' parents who are, let's say, interested in hiring a caregiver or babysitter for their child. They're on Care Connect, but they're not actually booking anyone. And we have 2 goals and 2 kind of proposed research plans for this one. So we'll take a look at them one at a time here. Our first one, research plan A, getting a better understanding of parents' experiences hiring babysitters for their kids. And the method being proposed here to do that is to conduct a series of 30-minute interviews with parents to gather insights about their past experiences finding childcare or hiring a childcare professional. So first one, kind of deep dive interviews with parents to learn more about their process. Second one here is a similar goal, understand a parent's process and priorities when looking for a childcare professional and the key information they need about them in order to confidently hire them. Now, the method for this proposed research plan, let's say research plan B, is not to do interviews, but to launch a design survey that shows babysitter profiles, maybe shows some key screens and information from the babysitters, and then asks parents or participants questions about key criteria and how confident the participant would be to hire a given babysitter. So without giving you all the details of the interviews and the nitty-gritty details of each study, we have a goal, which is to improve that conversion rate to bookings. And we have two research plans. A, which is conducting a series of 30-minute interviews to gather insights about past experiences finding childcare. And our second one, launching a design survey that shows profiles and asks some targeted questions about criteria and how confident the participant would be to hire them. All right, I'm going to put a minute on the chat here, but I want you to just put in the chat either an A or a B. Which research plan do you think is going to more likely ultimately help us get the insights we need to solve this problem of drop-offs or a low conversion rate from people who are browsing to people who are booking, let's say? All right, so let me give everyone a minute. What's everyone got here? All right, we got it pretty much a little weighted towards B, then deep dive with A. Good, nice. Lean towards A. Give everyone another 30 seconds. A, some optional questions from A if it's think aloud to get even more insights. Yes, I think we could use both A and B. Yeah, agreed. I like the way you think, Abdul. Depends on our appetite for change. Both have merits. I'll give you my breakdown on this. I would say that, let me go back up here. B is going to, strictly to the answer to my question, be a more direct path or more likely get us valuable, actionable insights as to what we can do to improve that conversion rate, taking someone as a viewer or a browser to actually hiring a babysitter from Care Connect. Now, interviews are going to be tough to argue against, right? You could, if you're doing 30-minute interviews and deep diving into the experience, preferences of a parent and how they've booked childcare in the past, you can almost guarantee that you're going to get some really valuable insights from that one, right? So anyone who is leaning towards A, thinks A is the correct answer, or thinks A should be at least part of this, I wouldn't necessarily say I disagree with you. But in the spirit of our workshop, in terms of maximizing efficiency and effectiveness, in terms of the time it takes to not only recruit, schedule, and synthesize a whole round of 30-minute interviews versus a design survey or prototype test that gets you directly on the criteria of a babysitter, I'm going to say that B is going to be certainly more efficient and it probably more likely to be effective, just given that it's more focused on evaluating the quality, credentials, trustworthiness of the caregiver themselves and not getting into a larger exploratory conversation about hiring a babysitter in general, parenting, or any of the other stuff that will probably come out in those interviews. So I guess in summary, A, I think could bring you a lot of really valuable insights. And I would not say that, you shouldn't be doing it just because it's taking a lot of time, but it's going to be a tougher sell to get the resources and the time needed to do those. It's going to take much more time, not just to facilitate, but to synthesize. Your responses and the amount of data that you have coming out of those interviews are going to be more scattered and kind of all over the place. Whereas with a design survey that kind of focuses in on a specific goal and method, it's more likely that you're going to get relevant feedback or insights here. And I think to anyone who kind of paired these together, that could be a really great solution, right? Using this as a tool to quickly unlock some of those potential topics or areas to improve, and then maybe diving into those later with interviews or some other method here. So in the spirit of efficiency and effectiveness, I would go with B. So this is all about focus, right? Getting out of just defaulting to an exploratory interview about the process in general and being a little bit more intentional about the method and the goal that you're using, the goal and the method that you're using to figure it out. Some ways that we can focus our research goals and identify some of these high impact areas is number one, to talk to teammates and stakeholders to learn about what those goals are. What are the biggest items that they're looking to improve? Maybe it's a certain drop off rate. Maybe it's a certain feature that's causing, I don't know, some kind of churn or someone leaving the platform. A lot of identifying even the right area of focus really comes from talking with teammates, especially teammates outside of the designer research world, who might have really valuable insights to offer, but don't really have a channel to get them through. Digging into past research to see if there are any areas of focus to dig into. Maybe you've done interviews or usability tests in the past that were kind of more focused around a certain, maybe wasn't useful at the time, but could point you in the right direction to focus your research goals and methods when a new subject comes up. And choosing the right method for the job, often it's not linear. This is something that's come up a lot when I've worked with more junior designers and researchers and people just getting started. It's definitely something that comes out of boot camp curriculums and stuff like that, where research is kind of framed as a step-by-step process. First you do interviews, then you synthesize them, then you go into usability testing, then you do a heuristic evaluation. And for those of you who work in the field and are doing this, even in some capacity day to day, that that's not the case, right? A lot of times we're using our bag of methods and tools as a researcher and digging into that at different points throughout the process to really find the right method that is going to match a more focused goal, and not just, again, defaulting to a certain method or defaulting to general interviews about a certain topic. The whole idea here is that focus of what you're trying to learn and being able to pair that with a more efficient method to doing it is going to help you get the buy-in on that research initiative, and also help you come back from that research initiative more likely to have actionable next steps and more tangible, impactful results to put into practice. All right, so let's keep it moving. The second one here, I would say, is out of the three that we're looking at, one that I see most commonly ignored or happening in a research process, and something that can lead to an enormous amount of wasted time. If it's improved even just a little bit, this can really make a big impact on how efficient and effective your research process is. So number two here, don't waste time talking to the wrong people. Who you choose as research participants really obviously impacts the efficiency and the effectiveness of your research. So this section is all about the strategies and and the impact of choosing the right participants for your study. So not all feedback is equal. And that's not saying that we're, in a disrespectful way, that we're not considering someone's feedback. But when you're looking to and diving deeper into the needs and behavior and looking to learn about specific experiences, we want to make sure that the things that we're considering, the feedback that we're incorporating into what we're going to build next in our product, is from people who are users or have a need for that product and is serving them, not someone who is maybe outside of that group and doesn't have a use case or a need for our product. And I think what this gets to quite a bit, and why this is such a common mistake that can come up, is the quality over quantity thing. It feels better to have a large pool of participants and a lot of people to talk to conduct usability tests with, to get feedback from. And that can be tempting to want to cast a wide net and talk to as many people as possible. But while quantity does matter, in some cases, really the quality of those responses and the experience of the people that you're talking to and getting that, soliciting that feedback from is going to have a bigger impact on your product. All right, so we're going to come back to a Care Connect example here and a different scenario that's going to hopefully help illustrate the importance and some of the key aspects of a good participant pool and talking to the right people. So our research goal as the, let's say, researchers for Care Connect is to learn how parents find and evaluate sitters for long-term childcare during the workday. And I would say for long-term, consistent childcare during the workday. Maybe think about two working parents who are looking for a babysitter or childcare professional 5 days a week from 9 to 5 p.m. That's what we're trying to learn about in this next research initiative. And for both of the examples, we're going to see they're going to use interviews. Now, this could be anything, but just giving you an example scenario of something more specific that you might try to learn about as a researcher for Care Connect, this long-term consistent childcare, and a method that you might use to do that in interviews. So to compare two of these research plans, A and B, instead of focusing in on the research questions or the methods that are being used for this section, we're going to focus on the audience. So we have audience A. This is who you're going to conduct these interviews with. Parents who have hired a caregiver for consistent childcare during workday hours. So whatever method we're using to find these participants, anyone who meets that criteria of a parent who has hired a caregiver for consistent childcare during workday hours, they're going to be in our pool of potential interviewees. Let's look at our next one here. Second definition, or second option B for our audience definition, is parents who have looked for or hired a child caregiver in the last 6 months with the intention of hiring them for at least 3 full work days per week. If we go back to our goal here of learning how parents find and evaluate sitters for long-term consistent childcare during the workday, and we're going to conduct interviews to figure that out, which of these audiences do you think we should go with? Who do we want to talk to? I'm going to give everyone a minute here, let you read these over one more time, and drop an A or a B in the chat. All right, we got a couple votes for B here. Now you can imagine there's going to be some overlap with these two, right? Just like our last example with our research plans, we could probably make cases that both of these could bring us some valuable insights in those interviews. Let's see. Jelen said B, more defined, the audience has the intent to hire, which is great. Bring insights, B is a better fit. So I would agree that B is the answer for this one. And I'm going to break that down a little bit more by starting with looking at A. So with an audience definition like A that we have here, or any that is going to be a more broad definition of the audience, and as I said, kind of casting a wider net, there is a larger likelihood that you're going to get diverse, which diversity is good in responses, but if it's unfocused or diverse in the sense of being unrelated or not focused on your research goals, that is going to add some complication. You could have someone who hired a sitter 8 years ago when their kids were toddlers. Is that feedback as relevant as someone who recently looked for or hired someone in the past 6 months? Maybe, maybe not. I needed someone to watch my child every Thursday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Does that fit really what we're looking for in this study in terms of consistent long-term workday childcare? No, but we didn't define that in A. We just said consistent childcare during workday hours. That consistent and workday hours, those are subjective, right? So we might get people who opt into that and say, yes, that's me, but aren't really specifically who we're looking for if we're thinking of someone who is, hiring for at least 3 days a week. And Ultimately, what will happen from this is the insights that you'll get from a less focused pool or a wider pool of participants that's less considered is that the insights and the findings that come out of that aren't really going to address, as I said, the question that you set out to solve, understanding more about long-term workday childcare needs. There might be some gems or some valuable experiences or feedback within those, but again, in the spirit of efficiency and effectiveness, you're casting a very wide net with no guarantee of really focusing on your ultimate research goal. So a lot of the times, what happens when you define a really broad or somewhat big to talk to and source them as participants, you'll come out of it with something like this: a gigantic wall or file of recordings or post-it notes and feedback. And while this might seem like a good thing, if those are coming from groups of people with vastly different experiences or recency in their experiences, that is going to be difficult, confusing, and in some cases misleading to sift through and figure out, what do we actually do with this information? How do we actually make a product decision based on all the stuff that we're learning for here? With a audience like B, we're going to get clear, relevant insights tailored to the research just by focusing our audience further. We are going to get, and being more specific with the criteria, we're going to get people who have recent experience within the last 6 months, and they're going to have experiences, maybe memorable experiences, that they're going to be able to relay and walk us through in an interview. All of those experiences are going to be more closely related to the topic and the goal of our research. And getting back to the specificity, not casting a wide net and saying more general terms like consistent childcare, but being specific with hiring at least 3 full work days per week. We know that we're going to get people who are in that target audience, and that's going to allow us to focus the feedback and the questions that we're asking and the data that we're getting back to make it more where we're going to have a higher concentration of experiences that are related to specific long-term childcare, and not finding ourselves picking through the research and saying, oh, does this count? They wanted to hire someone for 2 days. Does that count? Probably not. We're going to know that every one of those, even if it's a lower quantity of participants, is going to be relevant. So how do we do this effectively? One of the best ways to focus your research efforts on the right participants is to do screener surveys. Screener surveys are what you put out there to help narrow down your pool of participants. These are short questionnaires to ensure that the participants and the people that you're going to spend your time talking to and synthesizing and listening to their recordings actually meet your criteria for your research goals. You want to ask screener questions that directly align with your research goals, obviously. What I see a lot with screener surveys that are not effective is kind of defaulting to general demographic information, age, location, maybe something related to the topic that they're sourcing participants for. Screener surveys should be short, clear, concise, and specific. So we want to make sure that those screener surveys, that questions that we're asking, those, let's say 3 to 5 questions, are going to be highly targeted and highly considered to our research goals and the experiences that we're trying to learn from, not just filling it up with a bunch of extra or less relevant information about the participants. We want to specify timeframes and criteria to ensure relevance. Things like in the last 6 months, or consistent care at least 3 full work days per week. Now you can adjust this and change these depending on what your research goal is and what you're asking about. But if you have subjective language in there, like consistently or recently or fairly recently, this is going to open up the pool of participants. You're not going to be able to evaluate all of them in the same way. And if you get different answers to some of those interview questions and then go to figure out why afterwards, it's going to be pretty hard to get to the bottom of if you don't know that one person is talking about booking a babysitter 12 years ago and the other person is talking about doing it 12 weeks ago, 12 days ago. So we can adjust the specifics, but we want to make sure that we're understanding them, that participants or potential participants are understanding them, and that there's not a whole lot of room for interpretation or debate about who we want to spend our time hearing from and learning from in our research efforts. And our last tip for screener surveys is to learn and refine as you go. You won't always get your screener survey or your participant audience criteria exactly right the first time. Maybe you do something like this that we looked at here, plan B, and you say it's a caregiver in the last 6 months, and maybe you're not getting a ton of participants. Maybe you could extend that and say, well, you know what, let's say in the past year, it's still relevant, it's still timely. Someone can probably still recount an experience from a year ago just as well as they could 6 months ago. And maybe that'll open us up to a larger pool of participants. So when it comes to screener surveys and just recruiting the right audience in general and talking to the right people, you have to start somewhere, right? By defining your audience, but that's something that can adjust and change over time. If you see that there's something that might help you get better, more relevant participants, or expand your pool of participants without hurting the quality of it, that's something you can go back and do. And I would say in the times that I've used screener surveys, with almost near certainty that after maybe I had a couple participants or did a few interviews, I was at least making some tweaks to that screener survey to either get more targeted or to cast the net a little bit wider while still making sure they're high quality participants. So this one is, you guys are going to take over for this example here. Our activity, finding the right interview participants for RunBuddy. I want you to imagine that you're a researcher for RunBuddy, a made-up app. That's an all-in-one running app for logging runs, tracking progress, and building a running practice, no matter your starting point or your goals. Recently, RunBuddy and your team or your research team has noticed a growing trend of users who are creating plans or using the app to train for their first marathon. Your team believes there's an opportunity to create a dedicated in-app training program specifically tailored to first-time marathon runners. So your goal is to conduct interviews about first-time marathon training to understand a first-time marathoner's participants' needs, challenges, and preferences. And before we get into interviews and start talking to people, we have to define our pool of research participants. So let's say we start with this before our audience definition. Anyone who has, let's say, ever trained for their first marathon. Based on what we just talked about, we know this is going to be too broad. And while we will certainly get a lot of people who meet that criteria and maybe a lot of interviews scheduled, what happens after that is going to lead to a lot of wasted time, both conducting interviews with people who don't have relevant experience and then trying to make sense of all that to help us make decisions on how to potentially build this marathon training feature. So the activity here, I'm going to give everyone 3 minutes to rewrite this overly broad criteria of just anyone who's ever trained for their first marathon. We're going to do this just really light, quick activity. Your goal is to come up with, let's say, 2 to 4 specific bullet points to define a better pool of participants. So we're not focused on getting super granular here or knowing every piece of criteria we could need to know about the subject matter or our audience. We're just going to improve that very general audience definition of anyone who's ever trained for a marathon by offering a couple pieces of criteria that'll make it a little bit more specific. So some things to think about. Do we only want people who are actively training for a marathon, or do we want people maybe who have trained for a marathon in the past? Is their prior running experience important? Is that something we should factor into this? How recent should their experience be? What or are there any training behaviors or habits that are relevant, maybe If someone had a running coach or a team that they ran with, would that include or exclude them from our participant pool? These are all just some questions to get you thinking, and there is certainly not one right answer to this, but the goal here is for you guys to make it a little bit more specific than anyone who's ever trained for their first marathon. So let me give everyone 3 minutes here. Drop these in the chat. Come up with 2 to 4 bullet points. We want to find participants to interview about their experience training for their first marathon. I'm going to scan through some of these. So we have James said people who've signed up for an actual marathon within the next year in a current marathon training program. I like it, James. I would say that being in a current marathon training program, that would be higher on my priority list in terms of sourcing participants, because people who have signed up for an actual marathon, I'd say probably the likelihood is that they're going to train and run it. But that doesn't guarantee that they've started training. That doesn't guarantee that in 2 weeks they're going to say, this is, or they've even started training, or they're going to give up, which that could be valuable to learn from too. But I would say that in terms of keeping your screener criteria concise and effective, someone who's in a current marathon training program, I'd say is definitely a level up from just our first criteria of anyone who's trained for their first marathon. Mina said, run 10 kilometers at least 3 times a week as a routine. I like that a lot for how specific it is, Mina. And I think that is, whatever the distance is or frequency is, that idea of some specific criteria that shows you that they are running or they are actively training. Yeah, Luke got a couple of these. They run more than X times a week. Use tech to help you with your running. Good. Successfully finished a marathon with experience training for a marathon in the past year. Jelen, that's an excellent one right there. And Gladys said people who are planning to run their first marathon during the next year or have completed their first marathon in the past year. Out of those two, I would say the person who has completed their first marathon in the past year is going to have more relevant experiences about when that will help us design a program for first-time marathon runners. So they've actually done it versus people who are planning to. But good job across the board. Here's my board. I would say participants who've actively trained for their first marathon within the past 2 years, just extending that a little bit more, you could probably still recall some of the challenges or trials and tribulations of 2 years ago. Participants who had little or no experience with long distance running prior to training. That one, I know there are some different ones in the chat. That's one where we just don't have enough info for this example. But I would think if it's for first time marathon trainers, I would probably want to talk to people who have not run 15 half marathons and maybe people who are more like starting out with distance running, and participants who actively sought online resources or guidance to help with specific parts of their training. Now, this might not be perfect. I see some answers in the chat that I already like a little bit better than my audience here, but the idea is that now we're getting more specific. Any of these criteria, ones in the chat or the ones that you're seeing up here, are going to help get us more focused on the relevant people and experiences that we want to have, that we want to hear from, towards this goal of creating some feature that helps people train for their first marathon. If we go the other direction, really broad, we're going to have an enormous amount of feedback from all different contexts and timelines to dig through. And while we might get some good stuff, it's going to be hard to turn that into something actionable. All right, let's go down to our last one. Don't waste precious time with participants. So as we've talked about plenty tonight, research takes time. Even if you're making it as efficient as possible, it takes time. And one of the areas that takes often the most time in research are studies or methods that involve, one-on-one conversations with participants, interviews, maybe a moderated usability study. These are really valuable. And we all know that as having experience with research. These conversations are what can pull out a lot of the great paths or insights that are going to help us make good product decisions or identify new needs. But they take time to source people, to actually conduct an interview, to schedule, to make sure Zoom's working, and then all that time to go through those recordings and make sense of it. So with our studies, we want to make sure that this is an area where we can get a lot of value, but also where we can spend a lot of time or waste a lot of time if we're not asking the right questions. We want to make sure that if we're doing these more time consuming methods like user interviews, that we're really getting the most out of that one-on-one time with participants. All right, so our last example we're going to check out here with Care Connect is our research goal is we want to understand factors that build trust for parents when evaluating babysitters. That's what we're trying to learn about. And we are going to use interviews as our method. In example A, we have some sample interview questions. What sites have you used to look for a babysitter? What do you look for in a sitter? How do you know if a sitter is trustworthy? We get not the full maybe script or interview plan here, but some sample questions. Sample question B, some questions pulled out of the interview script. How important are references versus reviews in your decision-making process? How do you verify details like certifications or availability? Can you share in a specific example where a sitter gained your trust? What stood out? Real quick in the chat, which one of these do you think is going to pull out those more deeper experiences, the insights that are going to maybe rock our world with validating or invalidating assumptions that we had? Which of these plans, just from these little snippets, is more likely to produce those gems, those experiences that we're hearing from, in this case, parents that are going to be valuable to determine how they find or how they evaluate trust when looking for a sitter? A or B? B. I probably should have switched them up so we had some A's as answers. Last bullet point on B, I would agree. Yeah, and I would say, any of these, just like the other examples, these aren't bad. There are no like terrible questions in here, right? A lot of these will get us information about what we're looking for. But in terms of the goal, right, of understanding factors that build trust for parents, I would say B is going to get to some of those more experience-related insights, and ultimately, to our point of making the most out of our time with our precious time with participants, is going to be more effective in doing that. If we look at A, right, these are somewhat surface level questions, and the responses you get might be vague, obvious, or again, surface level. I trust my gut when I meet someone. If they have good references, that's usually enough for me. Again, not that these are worthless answers or something we can't dive deeper into, but if you're asking some of these more surface level questions, you're not really maximizing the time with your research participant. There are ways to kind of move past that a little bit more effectively and get into, again, really the gems, those experiences and stories that we're looking for. So comparing that with B, these questions are more likely to lead to more nuanced, actionable insights. They're kind of moving past some of those surface level questions of what sites do you use, or what are some of the things that you care about, or where have you looked for a sitter before, getting into, as some of you said in the chat, and Jalen said in the chat, their thought process, their experience, and all the pain points, challenges, and successes that go into that. So how do we not just write better questions for our interviews, but how do we maximize our time with participants when it comes to something like an interview or a usability study? The best way to make sure that we're making the most out of that precious time, talking, Zooming, FaceTiming, whatever, with our participants, is really to do our homework beforehand. Now, there are plenty of best practices on writing good interview questions, but I'm kind of jumping to something else here, which is assuming that your questions are not biased or leading. How do you ask questions that are going to maximize your time and kind of get to those experiences and those gems more effectively? And I said doing your homework. Really what we're talking about here is secondary or desk research. Preparation is the key to making the most out of that limited, precious time you have talking to participants. Desk research or secondary research is the homework, the research that you can do all on your own. You can sit in front of your computer and look at YouTube videos. You can look at websites, articles, social media, comments on videos and articles and social media, scholarly journals. Depending on what your topic is, there is a lot that you can do without needing to schedule or source or find participants. That is going to help you improve your understanding of the topic, the landscape, and thereby help you write better questions and maximize your time with participants. So doing secondary research is going to help you do a couple things. First, it's going to help you uncover maybe some common sentiments or topics, areas that you can dive into that you might not have thought of had you not done that prior research. Parents value sitters who are punctual and reliable. Maybe you see that coming up over and over again, and you make a note to ask some questions about a parent's experience and how they prioritize schedule, availability, and punctuality or reliability of a sitter. Doing secondary or desk research is also going to identify some frequently discussed pain points. Hard to find sitters with CPR certification. Totally just making that up, but maybe you're seeing some patterns or areas that, again, you might not have thought of on your own, but seem to be coming up over and over again in the research that you're doing and might be worth asking about or digging deeper into. Another good benefit or a form of secondary research is to learn from competitors, to see how others, sites, products out there showcase maybe a sitter's profile or their credentials or reviews, and using that as a way to generate some questions or to ask some good follow-up questions if a research participant says, oh, hey, I used to use this site to do it. If you're familiar with that site and maybe familiar with some of the features or some the process of booking a sitter on that site, that's going to allow you to be more prepared to dig deeper with some of those questions. Most of all, one of the biggest benefits of secondary research and being prepared is that it's going to build your confidence quite a bit. Not only is it going to help you ask better questions and maximize that one-on-one time with participants, but it is going to have you feeling more confident going into the interview, more confident that you understand the subject matter area, that you understand maybe some of the context or conversations going on around it, and your confidence to ask good follow-up questions. If you're feeling confident about your understanding or foundational knowledge of the topic and the questions that you're asking, it's going to be more likely that you're able to spot a good opportunity for a follow-up question, ask that, and get some really good responses or really valuable insights. All right, so this is our last activity that we're going to do here tonight before we do some key takeaways and a wrap up. We're going to come back to our marathon example here, and we're going to talk about doing some secondary research for RunBuddy. So same background, we're researchers at RunBuddy, and this time our goal, just like last, is to conduct interviews about first-time marathon training to understand participants' needs, challenges, and preferences. You're writing your interview questions. You did a good job finding your target audience from our last activity, and you've got some interviews scheduled on the Google Calendar. You're writing some questions and really thinking about how to make the most out of these interviews and how to really extract as much as relevant information about that first time marathon training process. And you realize as you're writing them, you need to go do some secondary research to make the most out of your time with participants. So I'm going to put 3 minutes on, and I want you to find one site, an online community, a resource, an article, basically anything that you can find on the internet, or if you have some good ideas, ones that are not online, that might help you conduct some of that secondary research and build that foundational knowledge and ultimately help you maximize the questions and your time spent interviewing participants. So let's see, we got local run clubs and shop. Absolutely. James, Blue Sky. Rachel's got Reddit here. Let's see what running events, Super Jock and Chill. Nice. Some local running events there. These are the ones I came up with here. Marathon training. I found just in some basic Googling and digging some Reddit threads. What are some things you wish you knew for your first marathon? Okay, so really, if I was doing these interviews, before even writing a single question, I would read this entire thread. I would read every comment in this to give me some ideas on questions, directions, and topics to look at there. So if you found that one or any of those discussions, great example. I found this video, best marathon tips I wish I knew as a beginner. This guy's talking about like running 5-minute miles for a marathon. The video maybe not as helpful in terms of secondary research. The comments under it and some of the other stuff, especially the discussions around it, valuable. The key is that whether you're talking about a social media, reading comments, watching videos, looking at more official or published resources, they're all contributing to that goal of having a better foundational knowledge, getting more exposure to some of the topics or subtopics, and ultimately maximizing your time with research participants, making sure that if you're going to spend a week interviewing people, that the questions you're asking them, the topics you're asking about are going to be as informed as possible and allow you to come away with some really great insights. So we're going to do some key takeaways. Okay, my first key takeaway, don't start research without a clear goal. Understanding and focusing in on what you're trying to achieve ultimately from that research is a very important starting point. Not only is it going to help you formulate the methods or the approach that you take to that research and your likely success rate to actually deliver those insights, it's also going to help you get buy-in, right? If you have a specific goal of your research, it's clear, and there's a clear connection between how learning about that is going to improve your product, your business, or your user experience. That is already giving you a huge head start. Choose the right participants. And as I said, who you talk to matters more than how many. Yes, quantity can matter, statistical significance and confidence ratings can matter, but where many researchers and designers go wrong is casting too wide of a net and dealing with all of the fallout from that, including scattered responses, trouble synthesizing it, and overall just feeling overwhelmed with the amount of data and what to do with it. Great research starts with great questions, getting back to maximizing our time with research and maximizing specifically our one-on-one time with participants. If we can't cut down on the time needed for, let's say, more time consuming things like user interviews, our goal is to make more value out of the time that we do have. So great research starts with great questions, and those great questions, especially when it comes to interviews, oftentimes come from the work that you do beforehand to prepare, understand, and build your confidence and ability to ask great follow-up questions. Okay, we know research is not linear and not maybe the step-by-step, simple 1, 2, 3 process that maybe some of you have learned in a boot camp or a class, but it doesn't also have to be a vague, endless journey either, right? We know that research isn't just that simple, straight line from ask questions to get results, but I think there is some merit in the pushback or the skepticism you might get from stakeholders, because it also doesn't have to be a big, expensive, time-consuming path to nowhere. If we can focus on our research goals and cut out some of the inefficiencies, like sourcing the wrong people or asking surface level questions, that's going to help us get closer to a more efficient research plan. And if we can focus it on some goals or outcomes that we know are high impact and we know are important, that's going to help us make it more effective. First and foremost, I just want to thank everybody for joining. You could be doing a lot of other things with your evening, your afternoon, morning, whatever time it is locally for you. I really appreciate it, and more so appreciate the great questions and contributions and participation in the chat.